And we're live. Welcome to the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values webinar, Antisemitism in Your Schools, How to Prepare. I will be moderating this. My name is Jennifer Richmond with the Institute for Liberal Values. And we've got Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, who is the Director of Education and Community Engagement with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, a researcher, a writer, and she always is addressing the center of the ideological capture in our K through 12 education system. Dr. Shufutinsky engages parents, students, educators, and administrators working to provide healthy learning environments. We also have with us Mika. Mika Hackner is a senior research associate at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. She has a PhD in politics, and her research has focused on the internal threats to liberal democracies and how best to challenge them. And with that, I hand over to you, Brandy and Mika, for the webinar. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So the webinar is about anti-Semitism that we're seeing in K through 12 schools, particularly since October 7th, and how you as parents can prepare yourselves, your kids, how to fight back. Brandy is going to start off by giving us background on what's been happening in the K through 12 schools across the country, particularly since October 7th. I'll then talk a little bit about teachers' unions, the roles that they play in fostering anti-Semitism, the role of activists in teachers' unions. And then Brandy is going to go over what you as parents can do, the power that you have in this situation, go over resources that we can share with you and ways that we can help you. The majority of the webinar will be given over to questions for you so that you can ask and share your concerns. And by the end, you should come out with a sufficient background, tools and resources, and a good grounding to prepare you for the school year. Over to Brandy.
Thanks, Mika. Next slide, please. So after the increase in on-campus anti-Semitism, many were hoping that summer break would lead to cooling tempers. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and instead there were calls to escalate anti-American and anti-Jewish demonstrations that have been plaguing our community for months. Next slide. Radical organizations that influence education use the summer break to recruit teachers to attend their teach-ins. Groups like JIDO, Teach Palestine, the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies, and the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism are just a few of the organizations that have been using the break and the war against Hamas to push propaganda like Teaching Gaza Now, a multiple narratives approach into classrooms. Requirements like radical ethnic studies coupled with anti-Zionism may lead to increased Jew hatred as students and teachers return to campus this fall. Next slide. Radical activist organizations have used summer break to organize for the fall, and they're planning to welcome students and teachers back to school with renewed calls that normalize Jew hatred and anti-American sentiment. Across the United States, anti-Israel activists are using our K-12 education system to spread Jew hatred through what appear to be official channels, like teacher training or professional development. Answering the calls to escalate, there have been numerous back-to-school teach-ins held for educators. And I'll hand it back to you, Mika.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So a lot of noise, rightfully, has been made about what's going on college campuses. But as parents of kids in K-12, you know that there's this big problem, a silent war going on in the K-12 arena. Since October 7th, we've seen countless examples of activist teachers that have been revealed using the classroom inappropriately to propagate an anti-Israel agenda and a hostile environment. And I'm going to give you a bit of background on how the teachers' unions actually help foster this. Unions, by their nature, have leaned to the left, so it's a fertile ground for the far left or progressive left ideas to grow. And teachers' unions have bought into and adopted a progressive left political agenda, which accepts uncritically that systemic racism exists, for example, that accepts uncritically that the world is divided into this binary of the oppressor versus the oppressed, and that accepts that the role of the educator is not only to teach, but to prepare your child for how to be a good citizen. which sounds innocuous, but this is an idea that is being promoted by teachers' colleges from the 1960s onwards and has gained popularity more so in the preceding decades, that there's a commitment to social justice, a commitment to anti-racism. A perfect example of this was that teacher in the campaign event for Vice President Harris in Arizona, who said straight out, "I saw education for what it really was, the greatest instrument of social justice in this country." And that is an opinion that is shared by all teachers' unions. If you go to the websites of the National Educators Association or the American Federation of Teachers, you will see pages dedicated to these ideas. If you go to your local union's websites, you will see pages and sections dedicated to how to foster social justice, how to be a good ally. And in recent years, teachers' unions have jumped on this anti-racism bandwagon, seeking to impose this very particular political agenda in schools. So the NEA, for example, the National Education Association, the biggest education association in the country, adopted a white supremacy culture framework, which holds that white supremacy culture upholds negative values of objectivity, love for the written word, and perfectionism, right? Now, objectivity and worship of the written word is something that I would hope that educators would actually want to foster, not criticize. But it's no surprise that in this ideological environment where teachers have been primed to embrace these kind of ideological claims of oppressor versus oppressed as sort of irrefutable truths, that they would then apply this logic to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, where Israel becomes the oppressor and the Palestinians oppressed, and by extension, Jews are part of the white supremacy cultural framework as the oppressor as well. Next slide, please. So one way to challenge white supremacy culture is to defer to the lived experience of marginalized communities. This means that extremist or radical groups can influence teachers' associations by claiming that they can reliably explain what's happening in the world because of their lived experience as the suppressed group. And the idea of education as a mechanism, as a tool for social justice, has allowed these groups to flourish and use unions as a vehicle to push the radical agenda. So unions embrace the idea that education should be a tool of social justice. Activists use the fact that they embrace those ideas to push their agenda forward. For example, Educators for Palestine is a group of educators advocating for the Palestinian cause. They've organized protests outside the NEA convention. They've tried to get many anti-Israel resolutions passed at both the NEA and AFT conventions. Or another group, By Any Means Necessary, they're a far-left group who again accuse Israel of genocide. They have members standing for leadership positions within the NEA and the AFT. So these groups infiltrate the unions, join them, and then try to assume leadership positions within them. And these groups are supported by activist organizations outside of the teachers' union. So groups like Educators for Palestine rely on outside far-left organizations to help them promote their agendas, to help them provide resources for teachers' unions. And so these organizations have a great influence on what resources are available for teachers to use in the classroom, right? If the NEA shares a resource that was given to them by an activist group, then an average teacher will look at that and say, well, it's NEA endorsed, it's fine. So you can go onto the NEA website and see materials that have been endorsed by really far left activist groups that look innocuous but are not. So for example, the Portland Association of Teachers shared materials from an organization called Teaching While Muslim. Teaching While Muslim purports to work to include social justice and anti-racist curricula in schools. But if you have a closer look at their materials, their class on 9/11, for example, argues that 9/11 was caused as a response to America's support for Israel, their involvement in the Persian Gulf War, and the presence of the US military in the Middle East. It says nothing about any other possible cause for why 9/11 might have happened. The Teaching While Muslim educator resources on Palestine includes an infographic on why schools should reject the ADL, and throughout the document, Israel is surrounded in quotation marks or referred to as a Zionist entity. Also shared by Portland and other local teachers' unions like the Massachusetts Teaching Association, but also the big national ones like the NEA, are resources from a group called Rethinking Schools. Again, Rethinking Schools describes itself as an advocacy organization pushing social justice. But they run something called the Zinn Education Project, named for Howard Zinn, author of The People's History of the United States, a leftist history book which seeks to sort of put all the ills of the world of the United States back, and has quite a far left analysis of the history of the United States. So, what are the warning signs to look out for in your child's school? Next slide, please. One thing that you can look out for is school culture. Does the school emphasize social justice in its documents? Does it have administrative roles that are dedicated to social justice or anti-racism? Does the school have a history of activism, encouraging students to take part in walkouts for any number of social or political causes? Does the school use buzzwords like DEI, microaggressions, or affinity groups? Affinity groups are where they separate out children, students, into groups based on their ethnic identity. Another thing that you can do is to check the syllabi. Does the school let you look at the syllabus? That's number one. Does the social studies or the history or ethnic studies classes emphasize settler colonialism? Does it use sources like Rethinking Schools or the Zinn Education Project or Teach Palestine? Or does it strive for balance? Do you see any effort for balance in the syllabus at all? And if you don't, that's a pretty big warning sign. Thank you. Over to Brandy.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So now that we know a little bit about what's been happening over the summer and over the months preceding the summer, the big question is, how do we prepare our kids for what they'll likely face when they return to school this fall? The number one thing a parent can do, and I can't stress this enough, but the number one thing that we can do as parents is to be aware of what's going on in our kids' classrooms. I know it's much easier to say it than it is to actually do it, but we're going to give some specific steps that you can take. So first, you can express to teachers and administrators how important transparency is for your family and for the well-being of your child. Children learn best when there's open communication and a positive relationship between parent and school. And good relationships can go a long way. However, that's not to say that maintaining a positive relationship is always possible or that it should be valued above all else. It's unfortunate, but bad actors take advantage of parents who don't want to rock the boat. The next thing that you can do is be involved. So if your school has a parent committee regarding curriculum, DEI, anything related, join it. We can talk for hours about the usefulness or uselessness of DEI programs in K-12 schools. And Mika, maybe we need to do that in a future webinar. But for the purposes of this webinar, recommendation is that you join anything and everything that will give you a voice and also an inside look at what's happening in your kid's classroom. You can't fight what you're not aware of. Collaborate with other parents. The chances are, if you're feeling like something isn't right, there's other parents that are feeling similarly. We're all well aware of just how many parent groups have sprouted up since October 7th. And although the reason for this is tragic, these groups can be a great resource. There's strength in numbers. Now, some specific things to look for or to request include the following, and Mika gave some of them. I'm going to give a couple more. So what community organizations or outside groups are providing teacher training or curriculum development for the school district, not just in your school? Does your school district have a contract with an organization like Rethinking Schools or Teaching While Muslim? Find out. And who in the district and at the school, who's ultimately responsible for approving teaching material? If a parent or a student or a teacher has an issue with what's being taught, something doesn't sound right, something doesn't feel right, something seems ahistoric, something seems biased, what steps are taken to address it and by whom? And lastly, but probably most importantly, what rights do parents and students have? So what rights do parents have to know what's going on in the classroom? What rights do students have to not be exposed to not just material that may make them feel uncomfortable, may have biases, but what rights do students have to receive an education that is factual based and not opinion based? Next slide, please. So some of the things that we do as an organization, we help parents navigate their school district to find out who the important points of contacts are. So who's developing curriculum, who do you ultimately, send an email to or call if there's an issue or if you have a question. We review curriculum and teaching materials for biases and discrimination. We meet with stakeholders to provide guidance on how to better approach transparency and oversight. We work closely with other organizations that are aligned in the fight against illiberalism in K-12 education. And of course, we closely monitor everything K-12 education related, from local, state, and federal level policies to the organizations that are actively pushing radical agendas into school, including teacher unions. And I think if it's okay with you, Mika, we can stop here because I really want to get to any questions, all the questions we possibly can from everyone who's listening right now.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're muted, Jen.
We do have some questions. All right, so one of the first questions is, since many states have laws about teaching free of bias and discrimination, can't the state law be enforced when teachers present a historical and one-sided content? Would the state attorney general be responsible for prosecuting this?
Okay. So this is like many of the questions. It's going to depend on the state. It's going to depend on the policy. It's going to depend on the district. Each state is different. K-12 education is mostly locally governed. So there are ways to report it to, say, on a federal level, to the U.S. Department of Education, to the Congressional Committee on Education and the Workforce, and all of those things. All of those steps are important to take, but it's ultimately going to depend on the state. There are not just state attorneys general. There are also usually a state level person who's in charge of education and curriculum. Some states call it like the state superintendent of education or of instruction. So it depends on the state. But if you have a specific incident, that's when you can contact us with the information, and we will happily do the research to find out who that person is who's ultimately responsible for enforcing state education codes.
And another, is there a legal or legislative framework I can rely on to argue that teachers are not allowed to take a position on a specific issue? I.e. that they cannot be pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. I'm a candidate for a high school board in California, so want to learn what I can use to back up my point of view. So for California, there's specific ed codes that dictates that teachers are not supposed to bring in their personal biases into the classroom. That's the short answer. And again, if there's specific information or more detailed information that you want, please contact us. And are there any curriculum that you approve of that you can recommend?
I mean, there's always groups out there working on curricula that you can look out for, especially when it comes to the more contentious subjects like ethnic studies or like history or social studies. And again, that's something that you can reach out to us, and we can help advise you depending on what school district you're in, what grade level, etc.
Similarly, you mentioned the Zen project, but are there any curricula, like any keywords that you can tell our audience what they should look out for if they see a certain curricula in the schoolroom or in the classroom?
Yeah. So if there's a focus on, again, if we're looking at even English these days, but if we're looking at history, social studies, ethnic studies, if the focus is on settler colonialism, if the focus is on oppressor versus oppressed, if it's talking about critical consciousness and how to sort of raise your critical consciousness, these are all things that should start to release warning bells in your head.
So you talk a lot about, or a little bit about the teachers unions, which I think is really interesting, Mika. And there's a question: are there ways to influence or get involved with teachers unions? In addition to what you've already said, how can we get involved with the teacher unions directly?
I think if you are a teacher or know a teacher who is involved in teachers unions, that might be a way to do it. But simple things like a lot of them will host webinars or seminars on particular topics. See what's going on. Keep a track of which teachers unions represent the teachers at your school, and then see what they're doing, and just keep abreast of what's going on in the teachers union itself. And that way, you can perhaps write to the local chapter leader, put some pressure on them that way. Brandy, do you have anything to add to that point?
Just one. I mean, there are a lot of educators that are whether it's the local, Jewish caucus, groups of educators that are really also equally frustrated and disheartened with a lot of the ideological capture we're seeing in K-12 education. So any support that you could provide to those caucuses, those groups of teachers that are also trying to push back against the radicalization in K-12 education, I would also recommend. But I would echo what Mika said, to be involved, to find out, like really attend, find out, listen to any of the things that they host, any of the webinars or teach-ins that are hosted by the unions.
Another action question is there a way to get rid of ethnic studies, the requirement in California?
Brandy?
I mean, anything can be, if you gather enough signatures and go through the process, anything can be put on as a ballot measure. And I'm sure that there are plenty of people that want to take that route. And, we live in a democracy. I always encourage involvement in our democracy. And that requirement is not the, easy button. I'm going to push it, and it's going to eliminate the problems we're seeing in K-12 education. And one reason is really what Mika said, and it relates to a lot of the research that she's done. This pedagogy that is really foundational to ethnic studies is seeping its way into multiple subjects. So there are states that don't have an ethnic studies requirement, where the classes are still just as anti-American and anti-Jewish. And I'll give an example of New York State, New Jersey as well. Neither of those have an ethnic studies requirement. However, school districts are bringing in organizations like Teaching While Muslim to develop curricula for kids, and also to provide teacher professional development. So just eliminating that one requirement won't be the thing that eliminates the troubling material we're seeing come into the classrooms.
So another question for you. With the ruling against UCLA against barring Jewish students, what can we expect in the upcoming school year, both in terms of hostilities against Jewish students, but also on whether or not the law and public sentiment will be behind them?
I think the law is behind us. It's whether or not it's followed through on. I think what's going on at college campuses is a different beast to what's going on in K-12 schools. You're not going to see sort of encampments or those kind of violent protests, I believe, happening in K-12. You might see more student walkouts. You'll see perhaps teachers coming to school in keffiyehs or changing their classroom, decorating their classroom in a particular way. But I think we need to brace ourselves for what is going to be a tense start to the school year.
Is there a curriculum for world studies that includes the Middle East already being used in California schools to push back if they are changing the history of Israel in lessons?
Now, there are a lot of organizations that are developing lessons that are historically factual about not just the history of Israel and the Middle East, but the history of the Jewish people. A curriculum is only as good as the educator that's willing to use it, and only as good as, and that educator is only as strong as the support she may have from her school, from her administrators. So I'm very happy that there are brilliant people that have been working on developing the finest educational materials that we've seen. And just to be frank, we're outnumbered. I mean, Rethinking Schools and Education Project, these organizations are huge. Mm-hmm. They are well funded, they are well organized, and they are already entrenched in schools across the country.
They've been doing this for decades and decades, and we are now playing catch up.
Another action item question. I have a template letter to superintendents and principals that parents can send to their school district leaders to inquire how their schools are preparing to handle anti-Semitism this school year. If I share it with JILB, can you take a look, make sure it's share worthy, and distribute it to the attendees here tonight to use themselves?
Absolutely.
A lot of parents I speak with want to open the conversation with their school and just don't know how to take the first step.
Absolutely, that's what we're here for. That's what we love to hear, and we're thrilled to help you. Absolutely, send it our way.
Yeah, and so everyone who is attending here will send back out an email with this and other resources.
Great.
So, is there room for a nuanced approach to DEI? It seems like we are throwing away the baby with the bathwater. Our K through 8 DEI efforts are much more balanced, centered on belonging and inclusive classrooms. Definitely not oppressor oppressed.
This is a really interesting debate, and it's one that we at JLV have quite a lot just internally for fun. I think that there can be innocuous DEI. There can be let's all appreciate each other and kumbaya. And however, the ideas that undergird it and underpin it, I think, are so inimical to liberal values that actually foster civic culture and civility, that eventually it ends up being more destructive than good. That's just my personal view. But again, there are others that say absolutely you can have a DEI that does away with the more radical elements and just emphasizes the elements that you think that are sort of about inclusivity and belonging. But for the purposes of what's going on now in K through 12, as Brandy says, whatever your stance is, doesn't matter. Just get involved so you know what's going on, so you're in the room of the conversation.
I want to add one thing to the DEI question. I think that when I like to start with what's the goal? What's the purpose of DEI? Because there's a lot of debate about whether there could be a good DEI. Can we make it better? Can we improve upon it? But rarely a conversation on what's the point. So within the American Jewish community, there's, well, just as long as your DEI includes talk about anti-Semitism. One of the problems with that is that ingrains the idea that you have to be oppressed to be included in a diversity, equity, and inclusion program. So that already starts off, like sets the precedent that DEI program will be oppressor versus oppressed based. It will be based on the oppression binary.
Absolutely, even if they're not using the language, absolutely.
Right. And so I think that really just starting with, well, what's the purpose of a DEI program and what's actually meant by equity? Does equity mean that we're erasing individuality? We're erasing agency? Everybody has to be the same. And if that's the case, again, even without using the word, the words, that is ingraining the oppression binary into that program.
Does Title VI apply to public schools K through 12? That's one.
Good question. Brandy, does it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not about applying to K-12. It's about, does it apply to people? And as citizens, all of those rights apply to us as people. How it is enforced, or if it's enforced, is more the issue we're seeing. There are already a lot of laws, regulations, codes on the books that if they were followed, we wouldn't be seeing the problems that we're seeing manifest in K-12 education. The problem right now really is an acknowledgement that there's a problem and an enforcement of the codes, the policies, the rules that are already in place. Now, we saw that in higher education last academic year with not just the encampments, with what speech codes and whether those violated the institution's bullying and harassment policies. So we're really having an acknowledgement and an enforcement problem, not a problem where there isn't a policy or a code or legislation that would offer protections that we would seek for our students and our kids.
How does the display of symbols or slogans such as Free Palestine t-shirt or keffiyeh by educators in the classroom be treated? Do these silent expressions of political opinion, are they acceptable?
So, I think that we have free speech in this country, but we also have schools with a code of conduct when you're on their property that you have to follow. It's a different question, I would say, if you go to that teacher's house, or you go into, maybe the teacher has an office that they're allowed to decorate however they like, perhaps. But I think in the classroom, political statements like that are necessarily going to be isolating, right? Even the other way, even if you had an Israeli flag, that might upset some other students. So, I think it's absolutely fair to challenge it, to say, you want to create an inclusive and welcoming environment for your students. Why are you allowing political messaging in the classroom? And it is political messaging.
Is it legally permissible in California to make U.S. history an elective course and replace it with a full year requirement in ethnic studies?
So some districts are doing that, not just with U.S. history. Say they're doing it with world geography that students would take their 9th grade year. There is leeway right now with the ethnic studies requirement in where districts are placing it. So which grade in high school they're actually replacing it. One of the reasons why that's happening is right now ethnic studies falls under the history and social science framework, the history and social studies framework that's in the state of California. So teachers can turn what would have been a U.S. history class into more of an ethnic studies related class.
Have lawsuits such as the Deborah Project and Brandeis Center accomplished anything definitive?
They're being newly litigated, but I think that we can see that even with the UCLA ruling, that yes, they are slowly but surely. They're a good tool. They're a good resource.
I think I would love to hear you guys go back a little bit on the history. So when did and how did this activism start?
Okay. So the Cliff Note version, the really brief version, I think it started really in the 1960s. You had influential authors. I'm going to mispronounce his last name, excuse me, but there was an author called Paulo Freire who wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the idea of that book is that education is a tool, is a mechanism for social transformation. So any lesson that you teach can be used to get students to understand or think about a new world, right? So a mathematics class is actually a tool, a mechanism to teach students to think about the world in a particular way. It's not about the maths. It's about the lesson behind the maths. And this was an incredibly, incredibly influential book, which was adopted by many teachers' colleges, many schools of education. And it's this idea of education as being a mechanism for social justice that has been taught through our teachers' colleges and through our schools of education for decades, which is why you get a teacher standing up at a campaign rally for Harris's presidential campaign saying education is the key tool for social justice. This is why this is occurring. And this is why you see activist teachers, because they have been, there's two things. Firstly, it's a fresh field for activists. It's an open field for them because they're entering an area where their ideas are championed and embraced. So it's a great and easy slipstream for them to enter. You're educating children. So that's a really easy way to start getting your political message out there. And the second thing is that it's a fertile ground to foster more activists or to get teachers to teach in the way that you might want them to, because you're able to influence them. So it's been started because of this change in how we think about education. And this change about how we think about education began in the 60s and 70s. So when I say that we are decades behind the problem, we are decades behind the problem.
Well, in part, in that answer, you answered kind of another question of how these organizations got into our school. And I think your talk on teachers unions was really, really interesting on that too. But I mean, just seeing that some of these organizations, and maybe you can give a little history of some of these organizations, are truly extreme neo-Marxist organizations. The fact that they've been able to kind of get in is of itself a wonder. Can you give a little bit more information and background on why they're actually active in our schools?
Well, they're active in our schools because it's not such a wonder, because they share the same ideological precepts and beliefs as the teachers and the administrators and the unions. And they're able to sanitize it through a language and through an administrative language that to the average person who isn't sort of steeped in this stuff thinks sounds normal or innocuous, which seems to be my word of the day, but isn't. So again, it's a fertile ground where they grow and they feed off of each other.
Another question from the audience. What is the potential to get school districts to formally adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism? And how can we overcome obstacles from people or groups who misrepresent IHRA? For example, the MTA passed sorry, Todd, I think I'm messing up your we'll just stop there. And how can we overcome obstacles from people or groups who misrepresent IHRA?
So, I mean, there are a few groups that are actually working to get the formal adoption of IHRA into school districts and also at the state level. Again, this is one of the ways you do it is you work together. You collaborate with other parents, with organizations that are doing it. You petition, you talk to leaders in the district, leaders at the state level. As a constituent, as a citizen, you have that right. You petition and lobby your elected officials, your school board, for them to adopt IHRA. In doing that, you have to be knowledgeable about what IHRA is and be able to educate and speak to it. Now, there are many activist organizations, the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies being one of the major ones, especially in California, but they operate across the country, that this is one of the things that they're actively working against. Actually, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism actually is too. They have an entire series of webinars and talks and podcasts about defeating IHRA, how dangerous IHRA will be for them because they want to be able to be anti-Semitic without being called anti-Semitic. Again, the adoption of IHRA is just one step. The follow-up is always enforcement. The devil is in the detail of enforcement with these policies related to K-12 education. We have states right now that have adopted IHRA, and you have school districts that are openly violating IHRA. So that's a big, the enforcement piece of it is a big part of why we're seeing a lot of the problems we're seeing in education.
I just want to jump in here and talk a little bit about anti-Palestinian racism, which is this new idea, which sort of mirrors IHRA, right? So they're saying that to be racist against Palestinians means to deny their indigeneity to the land, same as the IHRA definition, to deny a whole category of things. And this definition is has been adopted by the Toronto District School Board in Canada. So now a student or a teacher can complain that, let's say, if you happen to say, "Oh, I'm not coming to school today. I'm celebrating Israel's Day of Independence." Well, that might be anti-Palestinian racism because you're butting up against Palestinian claims to the land. That is now coming across to the US. We're seeing lawsuits and complaints waged against school districts, particularly in California, against universities, about anti-Palestinian racism and wanting to implement anti-Palestinian racism resources and training for teachers, for administrators, and for students alike. And we're seeing teachers associations like, for example, the Massachusetts Teachers Association talking about anti-Palestinian racism a lot. And this is going to be a challenge again when you want to make your claims for IHRA, because they're a mirror image of each other, and it's two claims battling each other. And one has a lot of activists and sympathetic ears pushing it forward. So that is something to keep in mind about how do we want to go about reducing the anti-Semitism in K-12 schools. Do we want to do it by enhancing our claims to particular speech codes, or do we want to say no speech codes whatsoever, please?
We're seeing so many students complain that the most common face of anti-Semitism they are facing is one of exclusion, losing longtime friends, being excluded from social and ethnic groups. What can be done about this when it occurs in the schools?
I think that that's a parent-child conversation. So it is very unfortunate, but that we're in the situation we're in. I don't think a couple of years ago people would think that we would be seeing the levels of normalized bigotry just widely accepted in certain swaths of society. We are. That's a really personal conversation for a parent to have with their child or their children about whether those people really were their friends. This is something that I'm a social worker, so for me, it's not just, oh, well, how does the school handle it? That's an aside. As a parent, how do you deal with your child's emotional reaction to their mental health when they're being excluded because of their cultural identity, because of their heritage? Fortunately or unfortunately, I think that many of us have a lot of experience in that because it's happened, it's happened before. But it's about making sure that your kid is confident enough to know that they deserve better. They deserve friends that are not going to dismiss them because of their heritage or their spiritual practices or any other immutable characteristic. And that if somebody does that, they're not really their friend. And that's a very tough conversation for any parent to have. And unfortunately, it's also very necessary. Our kids need to know to be proud, to honor their culture and their heritage and their ancestry, and not be ashamed of it because bigots are trying to make them feel ashamed of it.
Given the lack of standard definition of anti-Semitism, how can parents argue that something happening at school is anti-Semitic?
That's a really great question. I think, I was going to say, let me see it. I think that you can make a very strong, you have to know let me start my sentence again. If you think that it's anti-Semitism, then you need to be able to make that strong case for why it is anti-Semitism, right? Again, you can think about the IHRA definition if that helps you. You can think about your personal life experience if that helps you. You can use the language that they use against them. So, for example, well, it's not about the intention, it's about the impact that it made my kid feel X, right? If you really want to play that game. But I think we all know what anti-Semitism is. And we should be able to, I think that if a teacher is consistently talking about Israel over any other case, is maximizing the history of one particular strip of land over any other. Why, right? And I think that you can make a pretty strong case for this teacher. It might not be anti-Semitic, but what they're doing is, right? But it depends on the specific case for me to be able to give you a specific answer. So if there's a particular instance in your kid's school that you're worried about, again, email us and we can help you, shepherd you through that situation.
Do you have suggestions for key talking points for a 2-minute speech at a school board meeting? I love this question. I love the elevator pitch. It's necessary.
Yeah.
For key talking points, one of the things that I think we're seeing, unfortunately, is just open discrimination or the normalization of discrimination. So talking points related to that. It's unacceptable for any student or teacher to be targeted because of his or her identity. That's pretty accepted across the board in schools. And so when educators are promoting trainings or material or curricula or lessons that are leaning into discrimination, it should be pretty easy for district officials to say that is not happening in our school district, that is unacceptable, and to be able to have a reprimand for that situation. There should be a consequence for that. And again, that's part of being involved in your kids, not just in their classroom and not just in their school, but in the district, so that you're aware of what's going on, and can better prepare for what we're likely to see as the school year starts rolling out.
Related to that, a question to you, Brandy. What's the first step? Is it to reach out to the teacher? Is it the principal? Is it the school board? Is it all three? What are the practical steps we should take?
So I'm going to give my retired Navy wife answer. What I usually do is I inform the entire chain of command and let them tell me, oh, no, tell this person. And the reason I do that is because, one, just to make sure everyone is aware of the situation. Now, for me, unless there's something really egregious happening, if my kid's been called a slur, that's a different situation. If it's not that, if a teacher's bringing in like some completely biased or discriminatory material, it's more of a conversation starter. And so to start the conversation, I want to start the conversation with everybody responsible, because ultimately the entire chain of command is responsible for the well-being and the learning of our kids. So I would make sure the teacher is included on an email, the principal or vice principal, and the district level officials. That again is sometimes easier said than done, because there's a very real concern about retaliation, not just against a parent, but against your kid. And again, unfortunately, that is something that we've seen as well. And some things are worth standing up for, and making everybody aware so they know that you know what's going on, I think is really important. But my initial reflexive response is I inform the entire chain of command.
So aside from participating in school board meetings, how else can we in the non-Jewish community offer support?
I want to say, I'm going to jump in here for a second, Makeup. Sorry. I want to say this is not just an issue for Jewish kids, parents, or teachers. This is an issue for every American who thinks that our education system should be about our kids learning and not ideology or partisanship or activism. So we need to make sure that we're broadening the conversation. Yes, we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism, and that was really the initial thing that we saw, but we're seeing a lot of anti-other people as well. And ultimately what it is it's illiberalism. We're seeing anti-American liberal democratic values that are being targeted. And when illiberalism is flourishing, it just so happens that the Jews suffer. But again, Jews aren't the only people that suffer under illiberalism. Multiple other people do, and we're seeing it.
How do you advise adult children when you discover that their children's private school has an affinity group, yet the school closes for Yom Kippur?
Are the adult children bothered by the affinity group? I think that you should ask some questions. Why is this necessary? What does your child gain from it? Does your child enjoy it? What happens in these affinity groups? A lot of the time, what happens is, that they separate out the kids based on their racial or ethnic identity. And then it's to talk about, so if you're in the people of color affinity group, then you're talking about community and how important that is. If you are in the white people or white adjacent affinity group, you're talking about how you are part of the structure of white supremacy and what you can do to be a better ally. That's a heavy thing to put on kids, right? So find out what these affinity groups are doing. Talk to the kids, and then have a serious conversation about whether or not this is the kind of education you want for your child or grandchildren.
So would Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds of anti-Semitism be a good standard to use as reference? And I'm going to add another question in on that. Are the 3 Ds a good alternative to IHRA? And if so, what's missing from the 3 Ds that should also be raised?
I mean, I think they're good. But again, you need to, if you say, well, this is demonization or this is delegitimization, you need to come with the receipts. You need to come with the examples. So as a general rubric, yeah, it's great.
For our non-Jewish audience, can you give some background on the 3 Ds?
Yeah, sure. So the 3 Ds are delegitimization of Israel. So it's a separate colonial state. It shouldn't have been created in the first place. Demonization of Israel. Its cruelty is unknown in human history, and the way that it behaves is unprecedented, for example. And double standards, holding Israel to a higher standard than any other country. And these are things that in the Jewish community we feel and we see on a daily basis, particularly when it comes to the Gaza war and how it's being litigated in the press. We do feel that there's this double standard about how the IDF should behave. But these are three things that we sort of see routinely talking about Israel. And why is it anti-Semitic? It's because you're holding it outside of the family of nations in terms of how you evaluate it as a country. You're holding it to separate and different standards in order to be accepted. And it's because it's a single only Jewish state, it's hard to separate out that kind of delegitimization of a country with its people. And that is my dog.
If we have any other questions, now's the time to type them in.
I just want to say one thing before that. Majority of teachers are just trying to do their jobs, are just trying to be good teachers. And there is a loud activist core within them. But, you know, the first approach should always be, let's assume good intentions when I'm talking to this person, but also do your due diligence. What is this teacher posting or talking about? But I think that, I just didn't want to come across like I was tarring all teachers with this activist brush. I come from a family of teachers. So I just want to make sure that we know that most of them are just trying to do their job. And one of the horrible things about this is that the resources that they're reaching out to for help to do their job is stopping them from being able to do their job properly. You know, they want to go to the NEA or the AFT for help in teaching about anti-Semitism or about teaching the conflict, and they get redirected to extremist outfits like the Zen Education Project, and that's a real shame.
I want to remind in the chat there is a link to a survey that will help us for all of our future offerings. So that will also be sent out via email as well. But if you want to jot down that link now. Let's see, any other questions coming through? I think we've got most of it. Brandy, Mika, any final words?
I mean, I'm sorry.
No, you go first, Brandy.
I just want to say, I mean, first off, obviously, thank you everyone for coming and for listening, and thank you, Jen, for moderating, and Mika for joining me in co-hosting. I think that it is, again, I can't say it enough, to be involved. Get involved in your kids' school so that you know what's happening and you know what's going on, and use us as a resource. We are here. This is what we do. The power of K-12 education is often overlooked, which is one of the sad things of, you know, taking for granted a free public education. There isn't another system like it in the world. And it has the power to build or break society. And it has the power to tie us together, or it has the power to tear us apart. And I think it's really important that we pay attention to what's happening in our kids' schools, because we want to make sure they have the foundations they need to go on to be healthy, productive members of society. And activist organizations should not have the just free reign to come in and use our children and corrupt their education for the activist organization's own ideological gain.
Absolutely. I'm not even going to add to that, because it couldn't be said better. So I just want to thank Jen for being such a wonderful moderator, and Brandy, as always, for being excellent. And thank you all for your questions. And just to reiterate, we are here to help you. You're not alone in this. You can go to our website, email us. My email is mika@jlv.org. Feel free to use it.
Thank you, everyone.